The way I do this beat gon' have them bodies jump in, and afterwards to be with me because I got her blushing. I mean it happen every time that I be in discussion, and actually dog it's starting to get disgusting. The way I filter through their mind gon' make it meditate. The way I'm thugging on the spine gon' make a nigga hate. Usually wouldn't happen, but I don't care today. It usually wouldn't happen, but I don't care today, dog. Usually when I'm rapping, I got so much to say. Usually calling and texting, but baby, not today. Usually balling and flexing, but nigga, not today. Not today. No nigga, not today, dog. Still got the section, but we ain't hopping on yacht today. I get it popping, this energy start a damn parade. Dropping my phone and making time for the love and hate. Not today. No nigga, not today, dog.
I look at it from a prospect of what can I do and what am I going to do to change my situation, you know?
This that iced out new sprinter, no pretending. I promise from all this winning, this energy have been gifted from G.O.D. independent. She look me in my eyes and tell me she wanna ride, but not today, Missy. But my dog's finna chase, so not today, kitty. Yeah, I'm usually off the chain, but not today, pretty. Not today. No nigga, not today, dog.
Instructive that during a late season contest, when it was clear that the Saints were at last going to win one, the fans discarded their bags and went public once more. All this tells me that we purposefully manipulate the visibility of our connections with winners and losers in order to make ourselves look good to anyone who could view these connections. By showcasing the positive associations and burying the negative ones, we are trying to get observers to think more highly of us and to like us more. There are many ways we go about this, but one of the simplest and most pervasive is in the pronouns we use. Have you noticed, for example, how often after a home team victory, fans crowd into the range of a TV camera, thrust their index fingers high, and shout, "We're number one, we're number one." Note that the call is not, "They're number one," or even, "Our team is number one." The pronoun is we, designed to imply the closest possible identity with the team. Note also that nothing similar occurs in the case of failure. No television viewer will ever hear the chant, "We're in last place, we're in last place." Home team defeats are the times for distancing oneself. Here, we is not nearly as preferred as the insulating pronoun they. To prove the point, I once did a small experiment in which students at Arizona State University were phoned and asked to describe the outcome of a football game their school team had played a few weeks earlier. Some of the students were asked the outcome of a certain game their team had lost. The other students were asked the outcome of a different game, one their team had won. My fellow researcher, Avril Thorne, and I simply listened to what was said and recorded the percentage of students who used the word we in their descriptions. When the results were tabulated, it was obvious that the students had tried to connect themselves to success by using the pronoun we to describe their school team victory. We beat Houston 17-14, or we won. In the case of the lost game, however, we was rarely used. Instead, the students used terms designed to keep themselves separate from their vanquished team. They lost to Missouri 30-20, or I don't know the score, but Arizona State got beat. Perhaps the twin desires to connect ourselves to winners and to distance ourselves from losers were combined consummately in the remarks of one particular student. After dryly recounting the score of the home team defeat, Arizona State lost it 30-20, he blurted in anguish, "They threw away our chance for a national championship." If it is true that to make ourselves look good, we try to bask in the reflected glory of the successes we are even remotely associated with, a provocative implication emerges. We will be most likely to use this approach when we feel that we don't look so good. Whenever our public image is damaged, we will experience an increased desire to restore that image by trumpeting our ties to successful others. At the same time, we will most scrupulously avoid publicizing our ties to failing others. Support for these ideas comes from the telephone study of Arizona State University students. Before being asked about the home team victory or loss, They were given a test of their general knowledge. The test was rigged so that some of the students would fail badly while the others would do quite well. So at the time they were asked to describe the football score, half of the students had experienced recent image damage from their failure of the test. These students later showed the greatest need to manipulate their connections with the football team to salvage their prestige. If they were asked to describe the team defeat, only 17% used the pronoun we in so doing. If, however, they were asked to describe the win, 41% said we. The story was very different, though, for the students who had done well on the general knowledge test. They later used we about equally, whether they were describing a home team victory, 25%, or defeat, 24%. These students had bolstered their images through their own achievement and didn't need to do so through the achievement of others. This finding tells me that it is not when we have a strong feeling of recognized personal accomplishment that we will seek to bask in reflected glory. Instead, it will be when prestige, both public and private, is low that we will be intent upon using the successes of associated others to help restore image. I think it revealing that the remarkable hubbub following the American hockey team victory in the 1980 Olympics came at a time of recently diminished American prestige. The U.S. government had been helpless to prevent both the holding of American hostages in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was a time when, as a citizenry, we needed the triumph of that hockey team, and we needed to display or even manufacture our connections to it. We should not be surprised to learn, for instance, that outside the hockey arena, in the aftermath of the win over the Soviet team, scalpers were getting $100 a pair for ticket stubs. Although the desire to bask in reflected glory exists to a degree in all of us, there seems to be something special about people who would wait in the snow to spend $50 apiece for the shreds of tickets to a game they had not attended, presumably to prove to friends back home that they had been present at the big victory. Just what kind of people are they? Unless I miss my guess, they are not merely great sports aficionados, they are individuals with a hidden personality flaw, a poor self-concept. Deep inside is a sense of low personal worth that directs them to seek prestige not from the generation or promotion of their own attainments, but from the generation or promotion of their associations with others of attainment. There are several varieties of this species that bloom throughout our culture. The persistent name-dropper is a classic example. So too is the rock music groupie, who trades sexual favors for the right to tell girlfriends that she was with a famous musician for a time. No matter which form it takes, the behavior of such individuals shares a similar theme. The rather tragic view of accomplishment as deriving from outside the self. Certain of these people work the association principle in a slightly different way. Instead of striving to inflate their visible connections to others of success, they strive to inflate the success of others they are visibly connected to. The clearest illustration is the notorious stage mother, obsessed with securing stardom for her child. Of course, women are not alone in this regard. In 1991, a Davenport, Iowa obstetrician cut off service to the wives of 3 school officials, reportedly because his son had not been given enough playing time in school basketball games. One of the wives was 8 months pregnant at the time. Physicians' wives often speak of the pressures to obtain personal prestige by association with their husband's professional stature. John Pekkanen, who authored the book The Best Doctors in the U.S., reports that many enraged protests to his list came not from the physicians who were omitted, but from their wives. In one instance that reveals the extent to which the principle of association dominates the thinking of some of these women, Pekkanen received a letter from a frantic wife along with her proof that her husband deserved to be on the list of best doctors. It was a photograph of the man with Merv Griffin. How to say no. Because liking can be increased by many means, a proper consideration of defenses against compliance professionals who employ the liking rule must, oddly enough, be a short one. It would be pointless to construct a horde of specific counter-tactics to combat each of the myriad versions of the various ways to influence liking. There are simply too many routes to be blocked effectively with such a one-on-one strategy. Besides, several of the factors leading to liking, physical attractiveness, familiarity, association, have been shown to work unconsciously to produce their effects on us, making it unlikely that we could muster a timely protection against them. Instead, we need to consider a general approach, one that can be applied to any of the liking-related factors to neutralize their unwelcome influence on our compliance decisions. The secret to such an approach may lie in its timing. Rather than trying to recognize and prevent the action of liking factors before they have a chance to work on us, we might be well advised to let them work. Our vigilance should be directed not toward the things that may produce undue liking for a compliance practitioner, but toward the fact that undue liking has been produced. The time to react protectively is when we feel ourselves liking the practitioner more than we should under the circumstances. By concentrating our attention on the effect rather than the causes, we can avoid the laborious, nearly impossible task of trying to detect and deflect the many psychological influences on liking. Instead, we have to be sensitive to only one thing related to liking in our contacts with compliance practitioners: the feeling that we have come to like the practitioner more quickly or more deeply than we would have expected. Once we notice this feeling, we will have been tipped off that there is probably some tactic being used, and we can start taking the necessary countermeasures. Note that the strategy I am suggesting borrows much from the jiu-jitsu style favored by the compliance professionals themselves. We don't attempt to restrain the influence of the factors that cause liking. Quite the contrary. We allow these factors to exert their force, and then we use that force in our campaign against them. The stronger the force, the more conspicuous it becomes, and consequently, the more subject to our alerted defenses. Suppose, for example, we find ourselves bargaining on the price of a new car with Dylan Dan, a candidate for Joe Girard's vacated Greatest Car Salesman title. After talking a while and negotiating a bit, Dan wants to close the deal. He wants us to decide to buy the car. Before any such decision is made, it would be important to ask ourselves a crucial question. In the 25 minutes I've known this guy, have I come to like him more than I would have expected? If the answer is yes, we might want to reflect upon whether Dan behaved during those few minutes in ways that we know affect liking. We might recall that he had fed us, coffee and donuts, before launching into his pitch, that he had complimented us on our choice of options and color combinations, that he had made us laugh, that he had cooperated with us against the sales manager to get us a better deal. Although such a review of events might be informative, it is not a necessary step in protecting ourselves from the liking rule. Once we discover that we have come to like Dan more than we would have expected to, we don't have to know why. The simple recognition of unwarranted liking should be enough to get us to react against it. One possible reaction would be to reverse the process and actively dislike Dan. But that might be unfair to him and contrary to our own interests. After all, some individuals are naturally likable, and Dan might just be one of them. It wouldn't be right to turn automatically against those compliance professionals who happen to be most likable. Besides, for our own sakes, we wouldn't want to shut ourselves off from business interactions with such nice people, especially when they may be offering us the best available deal. I would recommend a different reaction. If our answer to the crucial question is, yes, under the circumstances, I like this guy peculiarly well, this should be the signal that the time has come for a quick countermaneuver. Mentally separate Dan from that Chevy or Toyota he's trying to sell. It is vital to remember at this point that, should we decide for Dan's car, we will be driving it, not him, off the dealership lot. It is irrelevant to a wise automobile purchase that we find Dan likable because he is good-looking, claims an interest in our favorite hobby, is funny, or has relatives back where we grew up. Our proper response, then, is a conscious effort to concentrate exclusively on the merits of the deal and car Dan has for us. Of course, in making a compliance decision, it is always a good idea to keep separate our feelings about the requester and the request. But once immersed in even a brief personal and sociable contact with a requester, that distinction is easy to forget. In those instances, when we don't care one way or the other about a requester, forgetting to make the distinction won't steer us very far wrong. The big mistakes are likely to come when we are fond of the person making a request. That's why it is so important to be alert to a sense of undue liking for a compliance practitioner. The recognition of that feeling can serve as our reminder to separate the dealer from the merits of the deal and to make our decision based on considerations related only to the latter. Were we all to follow this procedure, I am certain we would be much more pleased with the results of our exchanges with compliance professionals, though I suspect that Dealin' Dan would not. Reader's Report. From a Chicago man. Although I've never been to a Tupperware party, I recognized the same kind of friendship pressures recently when I got a call from a long-distance phone company saleswoman. She told me that one of my buddies had placed my name on something called the MCI Friends and Family Calling Circle. This friend of mine, Brad, is a guy I grew up with, but who moved to New Jersey last year for a job. He still calls me pretty regularly to get the news on the guys we used to hang out with from the neighborhood. The saleswoman told me that he can save 20% on all the calls he makes to the people on his calling circle list, provided that they are MCI phone company subscribers. Then she asked me if I wanted to switch to MCI to get all the blah 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 benefits of MCI service, and so that Brad could save 20% on his calls to me. Well, I couldn't have cared less about the benefits of MCI service. I was perfectly happy with the long-distance company I had. But the part about wanting to save Brad money on our calls really got to me. For me to say that I didn't want to be in his calling circle and didn't care about saving him money would have sounded like a real affront to our friendship when he learned of it. So, to avoid insulting him, I told her to switch me to MCI. I used to wonder why women would go to a Tupperware party just because a friend was holding it, and then buy stuff they didn't want once they were there. I don't wonder anymore. This reader is not alone in being able to testify to the power of the pressures embodied in MCI's calling circle idea. When Consumer Reports magazine inquired into the practice, the MCI salesperson they interviewed was quite succinct. It works 9 out of 10 times, he said. Chapter 6. Authority. Directed deference. Follow an expert. Virgil. Suppose that while leafing through the newspaper, you notice an ad for volunteers to take part in a study of memory being done in the psychology department of a nearby university. Let's suppose further that, finding the idea of such an experiment intriguing, you contact the director of the study, a Professor Stanley Milgram, and make arrangements to participate in an hour-long session. When you arrive at the laboratory suite, you meet 2 men. One is the researcher in charge of the experiment, as is clearly evidenced by the gray lab coat he wears and the clipboard he carries. The other is a volunteer like yourself, who seems average in all respects. After initial greetings and pleasantries are exchanged, the researcher begins to explain the procedures to be followed. He says that the experiment is a study of how punishment affects learning and memory. Therefore, one participant will have the task of learning pairs of words in a long list until each pair can be recalled perfectly. This person is to be called the learner. The other participant's job will be to test the learner's memory and to deliver increasingly strong electric shocks for every mistake. This person will be designated the teacher. Naturally, you get a bit nervous at this news. And your apprehension increases when, after drawing lots with your partner, you find that you are assigned the learner role. You hadn't expected the possibility of pain as part of the study, so you briefly consider leaving. But no, you think there's plenty of time for that if need be, and besides, how strong a shock could it be? After you have had a chance to study the list of word pairs, the researcher straps you into to a chair and, with the teacher looking on, attaches electrodes to your arm. More worried now about the effect of the shock, you inquire into its severity. The researcher's response is hardly comforting. He says that although the shocks can be extremely painful, they will cause you no permanent tissue damage. With that, the researcher and the teacher leave you alone and go to the next room, where the teacher asks you the test questions through an intercom system and delivers electric punishment for every wrong response. As the test proceeds, you quickly recognize the pattern that the teacher follows. He asks the question and waits for your answer over the intercom. Whenever you err, he announces the voltage of the shock you are about to receive and pulls a lever to deliver the punishment. The most troubling thing is that with each error you make, the shock increases by 15 volts. The first part of the test progresses smoothly. The shocks are annoying but tolerable. Later on, though, as your mistakes accumulate and the shock voltages climb, the punishment begins to hurt enough to disrupt your concentration, which leads to more errors and ever more disruptive shocks. At the 75, 90, and 105 volt levels, the pain makes you grunt audibly. At 120 volts, you exclaim into the intercom that the shocks are really starting to hurt. You take one more punishment with a groan and decide that you can't take much more pain. After the teacher delivers the 150-volt shock, you shout back into the intercom, "That's all, get me out of here, please, let me out." But instead of the assurance you expect from the teacher that he and the researcher are coming to release you, the teacher merely gives you the next test question to answer. Surprised and confused, you mumble the first answer to come into your head. It's wrong, of course, and the teacher delivers a 165-volt shock. You scream at the teacher to stop, to let you out. But he responds only with the next test question, and with the next slashing shock when your frenzied answer is incorrect. You can't hold down the panic any longer. The shocks are so strong now, they make you writhe and shriek. You kick the wall, demand to be released, beg the teacher to help you. But the test questions continue as before, and so do the dreaded shocks. In searing jolts of 195, 210, 225, 240, 255, 270, 285, and 300 volts. You realize you can't possibly answer the test correctly now, so you shout to the teacher that you won't answer his questions any longer. Nothing changes. The teacher interprets your failure to respond as an incorrect response and sends another bolt. The ordeal continues in this way until finally the power of the shocks stun you into near paralysis. You can no longer cry out, no longer struggle. You can only feel each terrible electric bite. Perhaps you think this total inactivity will cause the teacher to stop. There can be no reason to continue this experiment. But he proceeds relentlessly, calling out the test questions, announcing the horrid shock levels, about 400 volts now, and pulling the levers. What must this man be like, you wonder in confusion? Why doesn't he help me? Why won't he stop? For most of us, the above scenario reads like a bad dream. To recognize how nightmarish it is, though, we should understand that in most respects it is real. There was such an experiment. Actually, a whole series run by a psychology professor named Milgram, in which participants in the teacher role were willing to deliver continued dangerous levels of shock to a kicking, screeching, pleading other person. Only one major aspect of the experiment was not genuine. No real shock was delivered. The learner, the victim who repeatedly cried out in agony for mercy and release, was not a true subject, but an actor who only pretended to be shocked. The actual purpose of Milgram's study, then, had nothing to do with the effects of punishment on learning and memory. Rather, it involved an entirely different question. When it is their job, how much suffering will ordinary people be willing to inflict on an entirely innocent other person? The answer is most unsettling. Under circumstances mirroring precisely the features of the bad dream, the typical teacher was willing to deliver as much pain as was available to give. Rather than yield to the pleas of the victim, about 2/3 of the subjects in Milgram's experiment pulled every one of the 30 shock switches in front of them and continued to engage the last switch, 450 volts, until the researcher ended the experiment. More alarming still, not one of the 40 subjects in this study quit his job as teacher when the victim first began to demand his release, nor later when he began to beg for it, nor even later when his reaction to each shock had become, in Milgram's words, definitely an agonized scream. Not until the 300-volt shock had been sent and the victim had shouted in desperation that he would no longer provide answers to the memory test did anyone stop, and even then, it was a distinct minority who did. These results surprised everyone associated with the project, Milgram included. In fact, before the study began, he asked groups of colleagues, graduate students and psychology majors at Yale University, where the experiment was performed, to read a copy of the experimental procedures and estimate how many subjects would go all the way to the last 450-volt shock. Invariably, the answers fell to the 1 to 2% range. A separate group of 39 psychiatrists predicted that only about 1 person in 1,000 would be willing to continue to the end. No one, then, was prepared for the behavior patterns that the experiment actually produced. How can we explain those alarming patterns? Perhaps, as some have argued, it has to do with the fact that the subjects were all males who are known as a group for their aggressive tendencies, or that the subjects didn't recognize the potential harm that such high shock voltages could cause, or that the subjects were a freakish collection of moral cretins who enjoyed the chance to inflict misery. But there is good evidence against each of these possibilities. First, the subject's sex was shown by a later experiment to be irrelevant to their willingness to give all the shocks to the victim. Female teachers were just as likely to do so as the males in Milgram's initial study. The explanation that subjects weren't aware of the potential physical danger to the victim was also examined in a subsequent experiment and found to be wanting. In that version, when the victim was instructed to announce that he had a heart condition and to declare that his heart was being affected by the shock, "That's all, get me out of here, I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me, I refuse to go on, let me out." The results were the same as before. 65% of the subjects carried out their duties faithfully through the maximum shock. Finally, the explanation that Milgram's subjects were a twisted, sadistic bunch, not at all representative of the average citizen, has proven unsatisfactory as well. The people who answered Milgram's newspaper ad to participate in his memory experiment represented a standard cross-section of ages, occupations, and educational levels within our society. What's more, later on, a battery of personality scales showed these people to be quite normal psychologically, with not a hint of psychosis as a group. They were, in fact, just like you and me, or as Milgram likes to term it, they are you and me. If he is right that his studies implicate us in their grisly findings, the unanswered question becomes an uncomfortably personal one. What could make us do such things? Milgram is sure he knows the answer. It has to do, he says, with a deep-seated sense of duty to authority within us all. According to Milgram, the real culprit in the experiments was his subject's inability to defy the wishes of the boss of the study, the lab-coated researcher who urged and, if need be, directed the subjects to perform their duties, despite the emotional and physical mayhem they were causing. The evidence supporting Milgram's obedience to authority explanation is strong. First, it is clear that without the researcher's directives to continue, the subjects would have ended the experiment quickly. They hated what they were doing and agonized over their victim's agony. They implored the researcher to let them stop. When he refused, they went on, but in the process they trembled, they perspired, they shook. They stammered protests and additional pleas for the victim's release. Their fingernails dug into their own flesh. They bit their lips until they bled. They held their heads in their hands. Some fell into fits of uncontrollable nervous laughter. As one outside observer to the experiment wrote, "I observed a mature and initially poised businessman enter the laboratory smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes, he was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck who was rapidly approaching a point of nervous collapse. He constantly pulled on his earlobe and twisted his hands." At one point, he pushed his fist into his forehead and muttered, "Oh God, let's stop it." And yet he continued to respond to every word of the experimenter and obeyed to the end. In addition to these observations, Milgram has provided even more convincing evidence for the obedience to authority interpretation of his subject's behavior. In a later study, for instance, he had the researcher and the victim switch scripts, so that the researcher told the teacher to stop delivering shocks to the victim, while the victim insisted bravely that the teacher continue. The result couldn't have been clearer. 100% of the subjects refused to give one additional shock when it was merely the fellow subject who demanded it. The identical finding appeared in another version of the experiment, in which the researcher and fellow subject switched roles so that it was the researcher who was strapped into the chair and the fellow subject who ordered the teacher to continue over the protests of the researcher. Again, not one subject touched another shock lever. The extreme degree to which subjects in Milgram's situation were attentive to the wishes of authority was documented in yet another variation of the basic study. In this case, Milgram presented the teacher with two researchers who issued contradictory orders. One ordered the teacher to terminate the shocks when the victim cried out for release, while the other maintained that the experiment should go on. These conflicting instructions reliably produced what may have been the project's only humor. In tragicomic befuddlement, and with eyes darting from one researcher to another, subjects would beseech the pair to agree on a single command they could follow. Wait, which is it going to be? One says stop, one says go. Which is it? When the researchers remained at loggerheads, the subjects tried frantically to determine who was the bigger boss. Failing this route to obedience with the authority, every subject finally followed his better instincts and ended the shocks. As in the other experimental variations, such a result would hardly be expected had the subject's motivations involved some form of sadism or neurotic aggressiveness. To Milgram's mind, evidence of a chilling phenomenon emerges repeatedly from his accumulated data. It is the extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority that constitutes the chief finding of the study. There are sobering implications of this finding for those concerned about the ability of another form of authority, government, to extract frightening levels of obedience from ordinary citizens. Furthermore, the finding tells us something about the sheer strength of authority pressures in controlling our behavior. After witnessing Milgram's subjects squirming and sweating and suffering at their task, could anyone doubt the power of the force that held them there? For those whose doubts remain, the story of S. Brian Wilson might prove instructive. On September 1, 1987, to protest U.S. shipments of military equipment to Nicaragua, Mr. Wilson and two other men stretched their bodies across the railroad tracks leading out of the Concord, California Naval Weapons Station. The protesters were confident that their act would halt the scheduled train's progress that day, as they had notified Navy and railroad officials of their intent 3 days before. But the civilian crew, which had been given orders not to stop, never even slowed the train, despite being able to see the protesters 600 feet ahead. Although two of the men managed to scramble out of harm's way, Mr. Wilson was not quick enough to avoid being struck and having both legs severed below the knee. Because Navy medical corpsmen at the scene refused to treat him or allow him to be taken to the hospital in their ambulance, onlookers, including Mr. Wilson's wife and son, were left to try to staunch the flow of blood for 45 minutes until a private ambulance arrived. Amazingly, Mr. Wilson, who served 4 years in Vietnam, does not blame either the crewmen or the corpsmen for his misfortune. He points his finger instead at a system that constrained their actions through the pressure to obey. They were just doing what I did in Nam. They were following orders that are part of an insane policy. They're the fall guys. Although the crew members shared Mr. Wilson's assessment of them as victims, they did not share his magnanimity. In what is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the incident, the train crew filed suit against him, requesting punitive damages for the humiliation, mental anguish, and physical stress they suffered because he hadn't allowed them to carry out their orders without cutting off his legs. Whenever we are faced with so potent a motivator of human action, it is natural to expect that good reasons exist for the motivation. In the case of obedience to authority, even a brief consideration of human social organization offers justification aplenty. A multi-layered and widely accepted system of authority confers an immense advantage upon a society. It allows the development of sophisticated structures for resource production, trade, defense, expansion, and social control that would otherwise be impossible. The other alternative, anarchy, is a state that is hardly known for its beneficial effects on cultural groups, and one that the social philosopher Thomas Hobbes assures us would render life solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Consequently, we are trained from birth that obedience to proper authority is right and disobedience is wrong. The essential message fills the parental lessons, the schoolhouse rhymes, stories, and songs of our childhood, and is carried forward in the legal, military, and political systems we encounter as adults. Notions of submission and loyalty to legitimate rule are accorded much value in each. Religious instruction contributes as well. The very first book of the Bible, for example, describes how failure to obey the ultimate authority produced the loss of paradise for Adam, Eve, and the rest of the human race. Should that particular metaphor prove too subtle, just a bit further into the Old Testament we can read, in what might be the closest biblical representation of the Milgram experiment, the respectful account of Abraham's willingness to plunge a dagger through the heart of his young son, because God, without any explanation, ordered it. We learn in this story that the correctness of an action was not adjudged by such considerations as apparent senselessness, harmfulness, injustice, or usual moral standards, but by the mere command of a higher authority. Abraham's tormented ordeal was a test of obedience, and he, like Milgram's subjects who perhaps had learned an early lesson from him, passed. Stories like those of Abraham and Milgram's subjects can tell us much about the power of and value for obedience in our culture. In another sense, however, they may be misleading as to the way obedience typically occurs. We rarely agonize to such a degree over the pros and cons of authority's demands. In fact, our obedience frequently takes place in a click-whir fashion with little or no conscious deliberation. Information from a recognized authority can provide us a valuable shortcut for deciding how to act in a situation. After all, as Milgram himself suggests, conforming to the dictates of authority figures has always had genuine practical advantages for us. Early on, these people, for example, parents, teachers, knew more than we did, and we found that taking their advice proved beneficial, partly because of their greater wisdom and partly because they controlled our rewards and punishments. As adults, the same benefits persist for the same reasons, though the authority figures now appear as employers, judges, and government leaders. Because their positions speak of superior access to information and power, it makes great sense to comply with the wishes of properly constituted authorities. It makes so much sense, in fact, that we often do so when it makes no sense at all. This paradox is, of course, the same one that attends all major weapons of influence. In this instance, once we realize that obedience to authority is mostly rewarding, it is easy to allow ourselves the convenience of automatic obedience. The simultaneous blessing and bane of such blind obedience is its mechanical character. We don't have to think. Therefore, we don't. Although such mindless obedience leads us to appropriate action in the great majority of cases, there will be conspicuous exceptions, because we are reacting rather than thinking. Let's take an example from one facet of our lives where authority pressures are visible and strong. Medicine. Health is enormously important to us. Thus, physicians who possess large amounts of knowledge and influence in this vital area hold the position of respected authorities. In addition, the medical establishment has a clearly terraced power and prestige structure. The various kinds of health workers well understand the level of their jobs in this structure, and they well understand, too, that the MD sits at the top. No one may overrule the doctor's judgment in a case, except perhaps another doctor of higher rank. As a consequence, a long-established tradition of automatic obedience to a doctor's orders has developed among healthcare staffs. The worrisome possibility arises, then, that when a physician makes a clear error, no one lower in the hierarchy will think to question it, precisely because once a legitimate authority has given an order, subordinates stop thinking in the situation and start reacting. Mix this kind of click-whir response into a complex hospital environment, and mistakes are certain. Indeed, a study done in the early 1980s by the U.S. Healthcare Financing Administration showed that for patient medication alone, the average hospital had a 12% daily error rate. A decade later, things had not improved. According to a Harvard University study, 10% of all cardiac arrests in hospitals are attributable to medication errors. Errors in the medicine patients receive can occur for a variety of reasons. However, a book entitled Medication Errors, Causes and Prevention by two Temple University pharmacology professors, Michael Cohen and Neil Davis, attributes much of the problem to the mindless deference given the boss of the patient's case, the attending physician. According to Professor Cohen, in case after case, patients, nurses, pharmacists, and other physicians do not question the prescription. Take, for example, the strange case of the rectal earache, reported by Cohen and Davis. A physician ordered eardrops to be administered to the right ear of a patient suffering pain and infection there. But instead of writing out completely the location right ear on the prescription, the doctor abbreviated it so the instructions read, place in our ear. Upon receiving the prescription, the duty nurse promptly put the required number of eardrops into the patient's anus. Obviously, rectal treatment of an earache made no sense. Yet, neither the patient nor the nurse questioned it. The important lesson of this story is that in many situations where a legitimate authority has spoken, what would otherwise make sense is irrelevant. In these instances, we don't consider the situation as a whole, but attend and respond to only one aspect of it. Wherever our behaviors are governed in such an unthinking manner, we can be confident that there will be compliance professionals trying to take advantage. We can stay within the field of medicine and see that advertisers have frequently harnessed the
She my
respect.
best friend, and I got big shoes. This ain't no size 10. The way I'm rocking them, the way I'm walking in, the way I'm walking in. Cause she my little dog, she my best friend, and I got big shoes. This ain't no size 10. The way I'm rocking them, the way I'm walking in, the way I'm walking in. Cause she my little dog, she my best friend, and I got big shoes.